I chose this topic, even though it's a really complicated and difficult issue for many people, because it seemed to me important that that we get to understand a lot more about family violence. Little did I know, of course, that our communities all across this country would be dealing with the deaths of a number of women, and particularly more recently women in Ballarat. And so it seems timely that we think about this terrible offence and learn some detail about it. And so what I want to do is have you think about family violence in all its forms. But particularly I want to, as I come towards the end of this presentation, focus on a particular group, and as was said, predators. So let me start and take you back for me. I became a police officer back in 1972, a long time ago. I joined the police pretty much because my father said I couldn't. And he was a police officer. And he said to me, Christine, you can't join because there's no future for women. You see, women had been in policing since 1915 in New South Wales and not long after in other states, but there were very few of them and they hadn't progressed. So when I joined the New South Wales Police, my register number was 173, which means from 1915 to when I joined in 1972, there had been very few women. But joining in 1972, eventually my father became supportive. Little did I know or understand that in 2001 I would become the first female Chief Commissioner of any police organisation in this country. And luckily, more recently, there are female police commissioners in New South Wales and in Queensland and in Tasmania. And there are many more women in policing. But let me take you back to the start of this and my first dealings with domestic violence, as it was called. So I suppose I came to understand about domestic violence early. I was a police officer. Women didn't work in operational policing to start with, but eventually I was part of the movement to allow women to do that. And so I pushed for women to work in operational policing, and I was one of the first 3 in New South Wales in 1976. So my first domestic violence incident that I went to, I was out on the street. We pulled up outside the house, a house in King's Cross, and there was screaming, and we went inside. We were able to calm both people down. There had not been a physical assault, but clearly that may have been the next stage. So we calmed them down and we said to them, you know, they needed support, and we gave them access, some information about people that they might go and get that support from. I remember walking away and talking to my colleague, and we said, you know, just another domestic. And it was the way that people described, particularly in policing, but I think many other people in our community, that we saw it as something that was private, that was not something you talked about, was not something that the government should intervene in, even when it was more serious than just people yelling, but that's serious enough, but even when it was physical, it was kind of left aside. Now, luckily, the feminist movement had pushed government to think differently about it. But in policing, I remember reading a study by a guy called Morton Bard. He said the best thing the police could do when they attended a domestic was calm the situation down and walk away. And now I think about that when I think about what I'll have to say next. But what also made it really more relevant for me was there were a small number of policewomen, but a number of them were victims of domestic violence. And they were abused by their police officer husbands. And I thought, if it happened to them, it can happen to anyone. And so for me, that started me really thinking about how were we as a community, how were we as policing going to deal with domestic violence What I also came to know in the late 70s, by doing some work with a wonderful police officer, John Avery, was that about 40% of the work of policing was actually related to domestic violence, the calls for service by general duties police officers. As I was thinking about this speech today, I was also reading an article in the Sydney Morning Herald where the police in New South Wales are now suggesting that 60% of their calls for service in general duties policing is related to domestic violence. Recent research from the Australian Bureau of Statistics suggests that 27% of women and 15% of men have experienced violence from a partner from the time they were 15 years old. And children are present in at least 50% of those incidents. The research also over the last 15 years has expanded for us to understand a lot more about the harm of domestic violence and what it covers. So we clearly understand the physical abuse. What we've come to understand more recently is controlling behaviours, the emotional abuse, that's part of that process. We also, from about 2016 only, understand financial abuse by some very good research that was done along from Good Shepherd, from the Sisters of the Good Shepherd. And we also came to understand, of course, that sexual abuse is part of that. So that's the kind of range of issues that we've learned about. What we've also come to know that 95% of men and 80% of women do not report the violence or the abuse to the police. So what we're seeing is a significant underreporting. When you look at the calls for service that police attend, again, New South Wales Police said today they attend 500 calls a day. A day. So let me also now talk about the kind of topic that I wanted to, and this is about people I call predators in one part, because I think they're preying on their victims, and it's a very different issue to what many of us seem to understand. So and these offenders are ones where they will commit multiple offences against the same person. They will abuse children, their own children, they'll abuse neighbours. So all around the victim are many others who are also abused. Pets are also significantly abused as well. And so this Victoria Police in 2022-23 released this information and talked about 2,500 alleged offenders who had had 5 or more family violence related incidents in 1 year. So we're now moving to a group of people who have multiple offences in a year. They talked about 77 other offenders who had 10 or more incidents occur in 1 year, and 44 had 15 or more. These group of people are serial offenders. In normal policing terms, it would be seen as a repeat offender, and you would be working on that, and some police are. But the one I also want to come to is, from me in 2017, I went to a risk assessment committee being held in a suburb of Victoria, of Melbourne. And it was made up of people who were from different community groups, women's support groups, the police, education, and a whole range. And these groups come together across Victoria as a result of the 2016 Family Violence Royal Commission. And they're risk assessment groups. And these groups come together to look at analysing offenders and also trying to put supports into place. They share information. 2 men's names were raised in the group, and one of them groaned, and I said to them, "Why did you do that?" And they said, "Well, Christine, what we've become aware of about these 2 particular men is that our belief and understanding and knowledge is that those 2 men over the last 3 or 4 years have each abused 5 different women. So they move from one woman to the next woman to the next woman, and they're the predators that I'm talking about." So the committee said they knew of others as well that they had seen in that regard. In 2018, Victoria Police released statistics which kind of are a bit difficult for me to find at the moment but I'm looking further to it. But one statistic said, in fact, there are at least 20 men who had abused more than 10 women over the previous 5 years. Now, I don't know if that shocks you, because it shocked me. What I didn't know as the Police Commissioner, and the way that our statistics are connected, is you don't always know that kind of information. But these people exist. And they are the predators. The men who look for women one after the other to abuse. They are the powerful few, and as a judge recently talked about in one particular case, the scourge of our communities. So let me tell you about one of them. In 2022, an offender in Victoria was convicted of 9 charges of rape, 11 charges intentionally causing injury, threats to kill and assault charges. 4 women gave evidence against him. He had been in a relationship with each of those 4 women, and there were many other women. He was sentenced to 25 years with 20 years non-parole. And of course he denied the violence and said all of his victims had made it up. But he was convicted. Police who were investigating asked him how he'd found those victims. And he said, I go to shopping centres and find them. And that's what he'd done. And he's a predator. So what can be done? And in this last few minutes, there are a number of things we need to do. We need to do work on those serial offenders. Those who commit multiple offences against the same person, and in many cases that can escalate to more serious offending and murder. And we need to look at this group of people who move from one victim to the next victim to the next victim over time. That's a piece of work that I'm actually doing in my role at Monash University. But we also need to think about others. We need to understand who they are. And when I wrote the introduction for this, I'd hoped we'd be further down the track, but it's a tough space to work in. So we need to understand who they are, what their backgrounds are. That person I spoke to you about, who was convicted in 2022, had mental health, addiction, had been abused as a child, a whole range of things that were background. But we need to understand who they are. We also need to look at other kind of provisions, domestic violence orders. They're called apprehended violence orders in some places. New South Wales and Victoria Police have been doing a really good job of looking to get those people who breach those orders. But again, we need stronger penalties. We need to think about whether those orders are doing what we'd hoped it would be. We do need to set up investigative task forces. That man in 2022 was arrested by an investigative task force. And so the policing needs to put that energy into place. We need to look at custodial sentences and whether they're the correct length for these kind of offenders. We need to think about bail, and you will have been hearing these discussions more recently about why people get bail when in fact perhaps they shouldn't as well. We also should maybe think about preventative detention. Last year in Parliament, federally, they put in place a preventative detention regime for non-citizens of Australia. And maybe if we think the person is likely to commit more serious offences, we need to think about that. Western Australia has orders of lifelong restriction, which is once you are given one of these orders, it's significant. You're not allowed access to a firearm. There are a whole range of other orders. A registry of serial offenders, which is kind of gets a lot of commentators talk about this these days. But if that happens, I don't want the women blamed because they didn't look. I think it can be in place, and that would be helpful. We can have people wearing devices, which is an important part. But we do need to think about these offenders, and we do need to think about the policies and systems that are in place that we need to change or alter to allow that to stop happening. Domestic violence needs to be worked on by all of us. All of us have a responsibility to think about how we can make a difference in our families' lives. One of the things, and I come and talk to a group like this, and I've done that for many years in many places, what I know is a significant number of people here have been victims. And what I know is that a significant number as well may well have been offenders. So what we have to think about is it may harm you, and I'm glad you made that warning. There is support services available to people because it can bring up. But we've lost so many lately. that it's not acceptable and we need to do something about it. Thanks.